When we talk about risk, most people immediately think about danger, uncertainty, and the possibility of failure. And that's not wrong. Risk does involve those things. But what's often overlooked is that risk is also the doorway to growth. It's the price of admission to any meaningful story. Without it, you remain in the narrow confines of safety, comfort, and predictability. And while that might feel secure for a while, it doesn't produce much of a narrative worth telling. If you think back to every story that has inspired you, whether it's mythological, historical, or personal, it always begins with a character stepping out into the unknown. Always. This is not a coincidence. Psychologically, human beings are wired to respond to stories of courage in the face of uncertainty. That's because, deep down, we recognize that those stories mirror the struggles of our own lives. Each of us faces the same fundamental problem. Life is uncertain, and to live fully, we must contend with that uncertainty. Playing it safe indefinitely isn't really living. It's more like waiting. And no one tells stories about the person who never left their room, who avoided every risk, who stayed hidden from challenge. Why? Because nothing happened. No growth occurred. There's no narrative arc in absolute safety. Think about it this way. Imagine a hero in a myth. If that hero never leaves the village, never goes into the forest, never faces the dragon, what happens? Nothing. There's no story, no transformation, no wisdom gained. The risk, the possibility of defeat, humiliation, or loss is precisely what gives the story its weight. And it's not just symbolic. This is how life actually functions. If you want to become someone different tomorrow, someone more capable, more resilient, more admirable, you have to risk failure today. You have to walk toward what you fear, not away from it. This is why so many people feel stuck. They avoid risk because it's uncomfortable. They want growth without the uncertainty, success without the possibility of failure. But life doesn't work that way. Every meaningful pursuit comes with a cost. You can't separate the reward from the risk, because the risk is the very thing that shapes you into someone capable of handling the reward. Imagine wanting confidence but refusing to step into situations where you might feel nervous. Imagine wanting love but refusing to risk rejection. Imagine wanting purpose but avoiding every challenge that demands you rise to the occasion. It doesn't add up. The very act of stepping into risk is what produces the qualities you're longing for. Now, some people might object and say, but isn't risk dangerous? What if I fail? What if I get hurt? Of course. That's always possible. Risk, by definition, involves uncertainty and the potential for loss. But here's the deeper truth. Avoiding risk doesn't protect you from suffering. It guarantees a different kind of suffering. The suffering of regret. The suffering of what could have been. The suffering of knowing that you never allowed yourself to test your potential. And that kind of suffering doesn't fade with time, it grows. When you're older, you won't remember the nights you stayed safe and comfortable. You'll remember the opportunities you didn't take, the moments you lacked the courage to step forward. Philosophically, this is why risk is so deeply connected to meaning. The things that give life significance are almost always on the other side of risk. Think of starting a family, building a career, creating something new, or standing up for what you believe in. None of these come without uncertainty. None of them are safe, and yet they're the very things that give you a story worth living. It's not despite the risk that they matter, it's because of it. The weight of the risk is directly proportional to the meaning of the outcome. So, the real question isn't whether you should take risks. The real question is, what risks are worth taking? Because not all risks are equal. Some are reckless, destructive, foolish. But others pursuing a dream, confronting your own flaws, speaking the truth when silence is easier, these are the risks that define you. These are the risks that, when taken, turn the blank page of your life into a story someone would actually want to read. And here's the paradox. The very act of facing risk transforms you, even if you fail. In fact, failure is often the catalyst for the deepest kind of growth. We admire people who have endured failure and kept moving forward because they embody resilience. They show us that the story doesn't end with defeat, it evolves. And in many cases, those failures become the very chapters that make the story powerful. That's why risk is not something to avoid, it's something to seek out deliberately. Because in choosing risk, you choose the possibility of growth, of transformation, of becoming more than you currently are. So, if you want a life that matters, you cannot avoid risk. You must accept that stepping into the unknown is the only way forward. It's not optional, it's the fundamental structure of every human story. And the question is not whether you'll face risk, but whether you'll face it willingly and with courage, or whether you'll let fear write your story for you. No risk, no growth. No risk, no meaning. No risk, no story. When you think about the stories that move you most, whether they're found in literature, history, or your own family, they never revolve around safety. No one gathers around to listen to a tale of how someone avoided every risk, never made a mistake, never faced any hardship. Those accounts don't spread because they don't resonate with us. What resonates, what captures us, are stories of courage. Stories where someone confronted the unknown, risked something significant, and in doing so revealed a depth of character that we admire. And this isn't just entertainment. This is deeply psychological. Human beings are story-driven creatures. We don't just live, we interpret. We structure our lives as narratives. We ask, what happened to me? Why did it matter? Where am I headed? And in this sense, stories are not just accounts of external events. They're maps of meaning. They help us orient ourselves in the world, reminding us of what matters and showing us how to act. And what becomes clear, once you start to look closely, is that every meaningful story is an echo of courage. Consider the great mythologies that have survived thousands of years. The Greek epics, the biblical narratives, the legends of ancient cultures, all of them emphasize courage in the face of danger. The hero sets out, leaves behind safety, confronts chaos, and transforms through the struggle. Why do these stories survive? Because they reflect the underlying truth of the human condition. They aren't just entertainment, they're archetypes. They show us that to live a story worth telling, we must confront risk. Without that confrontation, the narrative dissolves into triviality. And the same is true in modern life. Think about the figures we admire in history: leaders, reformers, innovators. Martin Luther King Jr., who risked not only his reputation but his very life to speak truth in the face of injustice. Or the explorers who sailed into unknown oceans without certainty of return, or the scientists who put forward theories that challenged the dogmas of their day. These are not stories of people who chose safety. These are stories of people who chose courage, and we remember them precisely because they did what others were too afraid to do. Now compare that to the kind of stories we don't tell. No one writes epics about the person who stayed silent when speaking mattered. No monuments are built for the one who never tried because they didn't want to fail. Those lives may have been safe, but they don't resonate. Why? Because safety alone is not admirable. It doesn't inspire. It doesn't show us what's possible. What inspires us is when someone risks failure, even ruin, in order to pursue something greater than themselves. This is why stories function as proof of courage. When you tell someone about a risk you took, whether you succeeded or not, you are, in effect, revealing your character. You're showing that you are willing to step into uncertainty when you didn't have to. That act alone, regardless of outcome, carries weight. Because what you're really saying is, I refuse to let fear dictate the boundaries of my life. That's what makes people listen. That's why your story matters. And there's another important layer here. When you tell your story, you aren't just speaking about yourself. You're also extending permission to others. You're saying, I faced this risk, I bore this uncertainty, and I came out on the other side. You can too. This is why courage is contagious. The story of one person's risk becomes fuel for another's. When you tell a child about the hardships you overcame, you're not simply reminiscing, you're modeling. You're providing a narrative that says, the risk was worth it, and even when I failed, I became stronger for it. In this sense, stories are not just about the past. They are blueprints for the future. Now, some people might argue, but what if I fail and my story becomes one of defeat? That's a misunderstanding. Failure itself can make a story more powerful, not less. Think of the stories of inventors who failed hundreds of times before success, or activists whose early attempts were crushed before movements gained momentum. These failures do not erase the story, they enrich it. They show persistence, resilience, and the ability to face suffering without collapse. And in many ways, those failures are what make the eventual victory worth celebrating. A story of effortless success doesn't inspire. It feels hollow. But a story of risk, struggle, and persistence, even if it ends in defeat, teaches us something vital about the human spirit. So the question becomes, what story are you writing with your own life? When someone looks back at your actions, what will they see? Will they see a narrative of safety, of playing small, of avoiding risk at every turn? Or will they see a narrative of courage, of someone who dared, who risked, who stepped forward even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed? Because ultimately, the life you live becomes the story you leave behind. And whether or not people remember it, you will. You'll carry that story within you for as long as you live. The truth is, stories are the currency of human existence. They are how we measure meaning, how we transmit wisdom, how we inspire each other to act. And every meaningful story is built on the foundation of risk. Safety never wrote a legacy. Safety never inspired generations. Safety never carried the torch forward. Courage did. Always courage. So remember this. Your story will not be written in the chapters where you played it safe. It will be written in the moments where you risked, where you stepped into the unknown, where you acted despite your fear. That is the story worth telling. And if you want a life of meaning, that is the story you must choose to live. Courage is the pen. Risk is the ink. Without them, the page stays empty.